All right, I guess we are ready to get started. So, good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm Becca Lansbury, and I am the Membership and Communications Manager for the Native American Journalists Association. And I want to welcome you to the Gaylord College here at the University of Oklahoma for the kickoff of Day 2 of the 2015 Native Media Summit. So, if you're tweeting from this event, again, you can use the hashtag NativeMediaOK to let your followers know that you're here with us today. So the 2015 Native Media Summit is in its 6th year and began through our partnership with OU here at the Gaylord College as a way to engage our NAJA members and our tribal media practitioners. So in recent years, we've kind of switched up the format, giving attendees hands-on experience with programs for layout and design for print members, had speakers like Tom Arviso from the Navajo Times share his experience as a newsroom leader in gaining independence for the publication from the Navajo Nation, and other speakers and topics applicable to covering Indian country and managing tribal newsrooms. So our focus this year is on Oklahoma tribes, and with 38 federally recognized tribes located throughout the state, our tribal media members each have such a unique relationship with each of their tribes. And one of NAJA's goals is to facilitate conversations and the sharing of our ideas about how to best handle the specific challenges that come with this coverage. So creating dialogue around what is most exclusively a Native American issue for these communities is a cornerstone of NAJA's mission. So our first session is geared toward adapting free press templates for Native newsrooms, and it's addressing this important area by helping tribal editors create their own legislation or templates to be utilized by tribes. So NAJA is really proud of the work done by our Free Press Committee over the past year and beyond that to get to a place where we can offer this service and these templates to our members, especially to our tribes right here in Oklahoma. So I hope you can take time today to engage with each other and share ideas of how to improve coverage in Indian country, and we're so glad you're here. So I do want to recognize a few important people before we get started today. A couple of them are here on the stage. NAJA board members Jolene Sconchin, Mark Dreadfulwater, I don't think they're here yet, but they'll be here later today, and Shannon Shaw Duty, she's joining us here on stage this morning, and they volunteer countless hours throughout the year in sharing NAJA's mission, and their work is so essential to the future of NAJA. So our president of the board of directors, Mary Huditz, couldn't be with us today. She's presenting at the American Copy Editors Society on language and the use of the R word in copy. So she does send her best wishes to us here in Oklahoma today. This event also would not be possible without the input and direction of Brian Pollard, also on stage, and Kevin Kemper. And they also serve on our NAJA Free Press Committee. So we're so happy to have them here today. I also want to recognize some of our event partners, Vision Maker Media. We have George Lee and Eric Martin here in the front, representing Vision Maker. Excuse me, and John Hockett, who is Assistant Dean for Student Affairs and Administration here at the Gaylord College. And he is essential in bringing this annual event together, providing the use of this beautiful facility, and importantly, the food. So thank you all for your support of NAJA programs and of this year's Native Media Summit. So there's some information out on the registration table. Today's agenda also, they just printed some powwow flyers and some stomp dance flyers. So that'll be an event tonight, and then the event tomorrow as well. So there's more information available there. And if you do need to connect to Wi-Fi, you can use OU Guest, and you should be able to log in from there today. So I will go ahead and let these guys get started on this panel. They have a lot of great information to share with you today. So this is Joey Sinnott joining us from FOI Oklahoma. So thanks again for joining us, Joey.
So is this sucker working? I usually don't need this, but I apologize for the quality of my voice. It's better than it was Monday when I was trying to lecture to 2 classes. I teach at OSU, teach media law and journalism classes, and it's like our panelists have already been introduced, so why don't we go ahead and get started here. We're talking about the 11 essential items for an independent tribal media, and we wanted to go through today and explain how to do that and have a discussion about your different tribes and what might be needed and how to do it. So the first one up here, and by the way, this was primarily written by Brian over here. an explicit declaration of protected free speech and freedom of the press. And I noticed that the one element is it should be in the Constitution of the tribe. You want to talk about why a law, a policy might not be as good as a constitutional provision? I don't know. I don't think it's turned up very loud because I can barely hear you.
How about now? Okay. Well, I think when you're looking at the, how your government is constructed within a tribe, obviously you're going to have more authority the higher that you go. So if you have something written in your constitution, it's going to be something that the tribe really must follow as a part of how they do business as an organization and as a government. If you go down to something that is on the level of a law, laws can be changed by the council. At the Cherokee Nation, for example, we have a law that separates the Cherokee Phoenix, the tribal newspaper that I work for, from the other branches of government. It's called our Independent Press Act. And the issue with having it as a law as opposed to having our free press in our Constitution is that the law can be changed. And that's one of the things that I know Shannon and I have to always be diligent about, is making sure that our tribal government and the people within our government, whether it's the chief or the tribal council, knows that they shouldn't tinker with the law. Because when they start tinkering with the law, bad things can happen. Bad things usually do happen. And then of course when you get down to policy is can be changed at any time by the administration or by the principal chief. And so I think that why it's important to try to get it into the Constitution if you can is because that is basically the hardest thing to change in your government.
So what does it take to get something amended into the tribal constitution and actually then change it if you want to? I mean, I know what it takes for the federal constitution. How difficult that is? How difficult is that for tribes?
At the Cherokee Nation, we usually have the last time that we changed our constitution, which was in '99, we actually had a convention, a constitutional convention, and a bunch of parties came together and they kind of hammered it out and decided what those changes should be. And then it was sent to a general election and people voted on it. I'm not sure if it's the same for all tribes, but I know that's what is required at Cherokee Nation.
It's the same with the Osage Nation. You have to, your tribal council has, or a citizen of the tribe has to get so many signatures to require for the Congress to vote on an amendment to our Constitution. But back to the Constitution, I don't know if all tribes have constitutions or whatever they have, but the Osage Nation does, and free press is in their First Amendment. And it's the supremacy of law. The Constitution is always the first. No matter what law or policy, the Constitution reigns supreme. So if it's in the Constitution, you're great. But to get an amendment, however your tribes do that to your Constitution, if you have one, that would be the first step in looking into your laws to see what that would take to change your Constitution to provide that First Amendment right to your people.
Kevin?
I'll just make a brief comment. I've been involved in an ongoing research project, and one piece of good news I've been telling people, even though I can't give you specific numbers just yet, I know for certain more tribal constitutions than ever in history protect free press. I also know that there are some tribal constitutions that don't specifically say freedom of the press, but they use other terms like freedom of expression, or they talk about just this general sense of rights that people in that particular tribe have. So I'm not able, Or freedom of speech. Or freedom of speech. And so therefore, this is something that's growing in Indian country. Tribes in their sovereignty are adding these things to their constitutions as they update their constitutions. But I think it's really helpful, as they've explained, to have these protections in the Constitution because that's supposed to be the supreme law of that particular tribe. And it sends the message, we care about this, we want to enforce this.
So who in the audience, who of you have a freedom of speech, freedom of press, some sort of provision in your tribal constitution? Anybody know? No one knows? Which one is? Say again? Do you know how it's phrased? It's okay. Only about 1/10 of 1% of people can tell you what's in the First Amendment, so I don't blame anybody when they can't tell me what's in the law. But the reason I bring that part up is there are different ways of phrasing your rights. And there's a big difference. The First Amendment, federal Constitution, Congress shall make no law, and that's a negative right. Our state constitution, which I have to explain even to most high school teachers teaching civics, actually has a free speech and press provision in it. And it's written in the other way. It's an affirmative right. It says every person shall. Every person may freely speak, write, and publish. And the way courts look at that, when you have an affirmative, and by the way, a lot of state constitutions are written this way. When it's written this way, it's a mandate to the court that's overseeing it to actually extend protection. And as our Oklahoma Supreme Court has said, this provision theoretically gives more protection for speech and press than the First Amendment does. Unfortunately, state constitutions are ignored now when it comes to speech and press, and people don't put it to use. But, for example, for high school students, they might actually find more protection there than they would under Supreme Court interpretations of the First Amendment. So how it's written is also important, which way it's phrased. The second one is then, of course, establish an independent media, and ideally, again, within its Constitution. And I do want to point out again, yes, if it's in the Constitution, that should be the supreme law of your government. Something I've had to explain frequently to universities is their speech codes don't trump the First Amendment. So they'll say, well, we've got this policy. No, it doesn't matter if it's in violation of the First Amendment. So again, the idea is, why do you need this? Brian, do you want to sort of address why you need an independent media?
Well, you need an independent media because you have to have a press that has the editorial independence to look at what the government is doing and what the businesses that are wholly owned by the tribal government are doing in an objective way and report on it in an objective way. Because at Cherokee Nation, for example, and I think many other tribes are set up the same way, we have our government and then we have a business entity that is owned by the government. The business entity for Cherokee Nation now is making hundreds of millions of dollars. And so the government has an interest in protecting those businesses and really managing the message of those businesses and making sure that everything seems hunky-dory at all times. And so I think that it's important to have an independent media that can look at everything that the government does and everything that the businesses are doing and give some objectivity to what they're doing, because as much as I would like to think that our businesses always do things right, they don't. They make mistakes, and sometimes they do things that are unethical, and Cherokee people need to be aware of it. And I think even more importantly, the people who are managing our businesses and the people who are running our government need to know that someone is watching. And I think that there's a little bit of self-control that is required that may not otherwise be there if they feel like nobody is watching or if nobody cares. So that's why it's important. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think a perfect example, a current example, is what's going on with the Creek Nation right now. Is everyone familiar? I know Becca is. Is Becca in here? Becca's Creek. But anyway, is everyone familiar with what's going on with Chief Tiger? Their council is their council is voting to remove him because they're saying that he was taking money from a subcontractor to for some business that was going on against the tribe. But anyway, the point is that the Creek Nation paper does not report on anything negative that's going on against Chief Tiger. And I have spoken to some of their members, and they really, really wish they had a free press, because when it comes election time, they cannot say anything negative about anyone that's running for the election. So how is that a freedom, or how is that a right to their people to be fully informed on who they're putting in office to control all of their money? And we all know Creek Nation is a very, very powerful and rich tribe in Oklahoma. So that is just one big factor why tribes need a free press, is so we can inform the people of who is in charge of running all these businesses that affect our lives and our families.
Well, and I can understand you don't want to rely on the Tulsa World or the Oklahoman or some other newspaper to do the reporting, because you're closer to it, but unfortunately, you don't have an independent press.
Well, that's the thing that one of the tribal members that works for the paper told me. They said, unless if you constantly pay attention to the Tulsa World or the Journal Record or something else, you're not going to know anything else that's going on. And then that's an outsider's perspective.
Right.
The people that are in the community are more than likely to know more than that's what's going on, and will also seek out other tribal members' perspectives about their community.
There's one other point. It occurred to me this morning, the idea of a government being involved in establishing a media. I think then a good analogy, though, is with college newspapers at public universities, because there are a set bunch of rules now established by the courts under the First Amendment on what those public universities cannot do once they have established a public forum, which we'll get to as one of the issues here. So there are a set of rules that you could adopt as we go through this that would help you keep an independent media and have it in the Constitution. And I wish I'd thought of it earlier. I would have included those in here or brought them as a handout. But actually, I can provide them if you ever want, on what courts have already said you can't do. Public university, keep your hands off the content, leave it up to students, which is equivalent of leaving it up to the editors and the journalists here.
And that's a very good point, and that's the reason that I included that as one of the elements, is because I do see similarities between tribal media and university media.
All right.
Because you've got two competing interests. You've got the interest of telling accurate and unbiased information to the people, but then you also have an overarching interest from the government that's funding the organization, or in the case of a university that's funding the student newspaper, that wants to control the message, so to speak.
Yeah, believe me, those First Amendment cases all exist because the university tried to control the content of the student newspaper for the same reason. I mean, they would love to avoid embarrassment, scandal, criticism, controversy, everything. Sir, do you have a question? I made that exact point. I was going to say it again. We got something later to Kevin earlier. It only works, though, if you've got a court that will uphold whatever you've got in the Constitution and whatever rules you've got set up. I agree 100%. I think you end up doing what we do on open government issues, which is you go lobby to the people and say you've got to take control of your government.
Well, but I would suggest that there are some possibilities in work that I've done. We all know that in every tribe, whether you have courts or not, you have a sense of traditional law and customs. And I have seen examples. I don't know if this would work in your situation or not, but I've seen examples where there are problems, and when quietly you go to elders who have the kind of influence over everybody, and you talk with them about that, and you build this thing about calming things down, because I know that in a lot of tribes, there are those people who are in elected positions, but then there are those people who are elders who are respected by everybody. And if you can appeal to them and work with your own tribal customs and traditions for dealing with things, it doesn't always work. It's hard, but I can't say which examples because of confidentiality, but I've seen some examples where that's in the process and some people are making some headway. So I would just say you got to take every tribe where it's at and see how best to work within the culture and the relationships and the networks so even if there's not a tribal court, I'm saying there are ways that tribes regulate themselves.
Understand that. But believe it or not, all of that has been tried for years.
Sir, what tribe are you?
Yeah, I was about that. Which Comanche?
Comanche? You are a perfect example of someone we would like to work with. We have a free press committee on the NAJA board.
See what they say.
I will. And we're here to help. I mean, we really do want to help.
Yeah,
So-
what she's offering is she'll try to help you get through those roadblocks, and so you don't feel like you're banging your head all the time against the wall by yourselves. Yeah. One of the things what I come across in open government issues is people, particularly in small towns, and they'll get involved in some issue and they'll start asking questions. They're not reporters. They're just, people are involved for some reason, and they'll feel alone when they're getting told no. And you can't, it's small towns, the same thing. Small group of people might be running the town. They're controlling the flow of information, and those folks feel alone. And what they do when they start to reach out through FOI Oklahoma, myself, is they realize they're not alone. And that gives them a lot of hope, and it gives them a lot of resources and other folks to go to bat for them, which is what I do on open government issues. So I implore you to work with them and
In tribal council meeting, people speak up, tribal cops come and escort them out. What do you try? How do you get hurt?
Have you tried, well, this could be very extensive and something out of your range, but he's in charge of the NAJA Legal Helpline, and I don't want to be involved in any kind of federal lawsuit, but if there's,
But
if there's nothing else, no one else to turn to, there's always that level.
I would also remind y'all that what some high school students now do is they've learned, because believe me, there's more censorship at high schools than there is at any place else, but they've learned to make use of social media. And it doesn't cost like to go out and print a newspaper. So they have their own Twitter. They have their own blogs now, WordPress. You can go out Facebook and create. I know people on open government issues in small towns went and created their own Facebook publications. So make use of that, because essentially what I think you need to try to do, or what you might work, I hope, is what we use on a lot of local officials, and that's try to shame them. So if you're talking about somebody actually getting arrested or hauled out of a meeting for speaking up and criticizing government, that's something that the rest of us need to hear. And I understand that tribes have different policies, rules on who can be in a council meeting. So the Tulsa World or the Oklahoman or some other journal reporter might not be in there. But if you can let them know through social media, and if you can use this snazzy little thing that's got, now it's basically a camera with a phone attached, and take your pictures, take the video. We have a lot of folks that do that. They upload it, and they show, here's the evidence of what happened.
Joey, I love your suggestion, and I don't want to put a chill on it. But, the Blackfeet Tribal Council jailed someone for Facebook comments a couple of years ago.
And see, that, I
And
think, deserves
so-
a lawsuit of some kind.
Huh?
Does the Comanche Nation have a jail?
I think they use the county.
Hmm.
I don't know where the CFR court, they actually use the CFR court, but they don't, the
Yeah. Well, and I think the point is, too, and we have like 9 other
Yeah.
elements to get to, but like, regardless of the tribe, yeah, it's going to be hard. It's difficult legally. It's difficult culturally, but there are those of us who care about this issue, and there are those of us who want, as Shannon said, and I totally affirm what she said, we're here to be a service. We're here to help people within tribes to put together the kinds of laws that work for your tribe, that work for your people. And, hopefully the rest of these elements will get to that.
If you get arrested for Facebooking, will you please let me know? I'll help you raise hell about it. I'll try to bail you. I will find some money from somebody. We'll bail you out. But I know I can help you raise hell. And, of course, then it talks about if you can't do it in your Constitution, to do it through a legislative act, but it's always better to have it in a Constitution.
Yep.
And so it talks about what an act should try to guarantee the language of it. So definitely protection for free speech, free press, independence from undue political influence. That could be said of most large newspapers anywhere, that we hope they're free from undue political influence. An independent governing body, and the rest of these, we'll be going through these in more detail in a minute. Commitment to the ethics of journalism, professional journalist as a tenure chief executive editor, and a duty to publish without prior restraint or fear of reprisal by the government. And these are some of the very things that we talk about with college media. So creating an independent editorial board. Brian, does the Cherokee, your Phoenix does have one, right? Am I correct?
Yeah, we have an editorial board, and it was created within the Independent Press Act. It's a 5-person board. 3 of those members have to be experienced journalists, and the editorial board is very, very important because it's a policy board, and its responsibility is to look at all the policies of the organization and to ensure that the policies that govern the Cherokee Phoenix are unbiased, and that we're not acting in a way that's unfair because we have bad policy. And so it's their responsibility to set policy in place. And also they serve as a buffer to some degree between me as the chief executive and the government, because I answer to the board. I don't answer to the chief. I don't answer to the tribal council. I answer to the board. And so if I'm not behaving and the chief isn't happy with me, or some tribal counselors aren't happy with me, I can say, go to the board. If you think that I'm violating our policies, or if I'm acting in a way that's unprofessional, take it to the editorial board. And so the board is there in some ways to protect me and to protect the organization, and act as kind of a buffer between the newspaper or the Cherokee Phoenix and the tribal government. So
does the Osage News have an independent board?
We're the same way, except for ours is a 3-person board, and 2 of the members have to have journalism experience, and it acts as a buffer, and it's almost exactly the same as the Cherokee Phoenix. And actually, we modeled our Independent Press Act from the Cherokee Phoenixes.
Kevin? So, anyone know out here if you've got for your newspaper an independent editorial board, governing body? And I started to say student because that's on my mind, because another model is, and I've served on it for the last 3 years at OSU, student newspapers typically have an independent governing body separate from the university that can also act as a shield. College Media Advisors has a number of recommendations and models for how to put those together, and I think yours is probably a model for tribal newspapers. So, Benny, did you say yours? You raised your hand, yes? Oh, sorry. Hello, sorry. That's okay. Yeah.
So that's the premise. Does it actually work like that? Brian, does it work like that?
We have had occasion where at OSU they have someone high up has directly complained to a student, and they haven't done it since I wrote a column explaining why free press, a student newspaper, and why it is a free press. And, so I think they backed off once they learned a lesson on that. But on the other hand, our student editors, I don't think they're weekly, but maybe monthly, have had meetings with both President Hargis and his predecessor where they get together and just talk. So, you know, there's still that open communication. Does the chief still call you up or somebody else higher in authority call you up and chew you out?
No, that actually hasn't happened to me in several years. But to your point or to your question, they do get complaints. The board, people know that they're on the editorial board and people go to them directly with complaints. What I've found 95% of the time is that people just need to vent about something that they're not happy with in the paper. And it doesn't get much further than that, because when the board talks to me about the complaint, I'll say, okay, if they think that we're unbiased, or that if they think that we're biased, for example, tell them to come talk to me, show me what it is that they're concerned with, and I will address it in a professional way. I'll identify what the problem might be, and if we did something wrong, then I will apply a remedy to that. And like I said, 95% of the time, I never hear from anybody. And so I think most of it is just they feel like they just need to vent about something they're not happy with, and then it evaporates after that.
So we're talking about people in government. What about readers? Do they go? I mean, as an editor, I would want my readers, even if they're complaining, to call me or the reporters and talk to us. So is this more of a barrier between you and the government, or you and the readers as well?
I would say that our editorial board tends to get complaints from people in government. Our readers will tend to actually complain to the reporters.
All right.
And so the reporters will field the complaint, and I'll tell the reporters the same thing. I'm like, if you feel like this person has a legitimate complaint, send them to me, and I'll address it. I'll look at what they're concerned about, and I'll do the same thing. I mean, I handle it the same no matter where it's coming from, because to me, good journalism is good journalism, and I can look at something and I can identify what a problem. If we have poor reporting, I can identify where that came from, and I can figure out how to address it and how to remedy it. And so it doesn't matter to me where the complaint comes from. I want to look at it either way.
Something I wish I had thought of at the very beginning of this is who out in the audience actually does work at a tribal newspaper? We have nobody? Who's wanting to set one up and that's what you're trying to figure out how to do? One? Okay, which tribe is that? Pawnee? Okay.
Good.
Can help you with that too.
Yeah. Yeah. Uh-huh.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that would always help. All right, so I was trying to figure out our audience, and our audience is, we might be doing this. So when you establish that independent editorial board, some language, explain how the members are appointed. Again, that's how it works for a student newspaper, college newspaper. And by the way, I'm not trying to be demeaning when I say student. It's a college run, it's professional as they can be. It's just a model, I think, on how to run something where government's so heavily involved. The terms of the appointment and, some expression that they should, and which, by the way, this isn't in the model for college newspapers, is that they should be free from undue political influence. Something that says, don't put the strong arm on the members of the editorial board. And the powers that that board should have: hire and terminate the chief executive, ensure sound operational management, hold public meetings. OSU's Student Media Board, it's a public body, it holds public meetings, and approve organizational policies. Yes, ma'am.
The reason why we have to have these models is because our papers are paid for
Yeah,
by the government. Like
right.
that's the big thing, is that we couldn't exist without that revenue from our nations. We don't have the tribal members in numbers to exist wholly on our own. And this is why there's many news organizations out there that have sponsors, that have companies that run them, and they all have to deal with this type of thing. Do we print something negative about the company that runs us? Like, let's say a company like Nike is a huge contributor to your news organization. Well, we can't print anything about Nike. That's bad. It's the same thing, except for it's your tribe. That's the only thing. And we have to have these protections against our tribe to have this service for our people. That's why we have to have all of these, because they pay for us.
Yeah, and I just jumped ahead to the number 8 in the elements, which is funding, which is what we talk about. And that's, again, what I realized this morning is the analogy is college newspapers typically can't survive either. I mean, essentially, they are taxing the students through fees to help pay for some of it. And everybody in media right now realizes advertising has almost disappeared, especially for the smaller newspapers. It's tough to come up with enough money to actually hire staff and do quality journalism. So most tribes don't have enough audience volume to pay for subscribers. So some of the other elements is then, yeah, if you're going to have the tribe providing money for your organizational budget, you still need to have some sort of explanation in the Constitution, you would hope, that does not give the tribal government the power to dictate editorial content. Same thing works. There's a Fifth Circuit opinion from the 70s that's been adopted everywhere else that basically says universities are not the unrestrained master of what they create. And we'll come back in a minute then to public forums and why that is, but it's the same idea here.
Yeah, and that particular element is very personal to me, and the reason that I wanted to include it is because we recently experienced that just a couple of years ago. The Tribal Council, completely out of the blue, cut the budget for the Cherokee Phoenix by 25%, which is a pretty deep cut. We have 9 casinos making hundreds of millions of dollars, but they felt like they needed to cut the tribal newspaper by 25%. That was a hefty cut, and it really sent a message to me at how delicate we actually are. And of course they justified it at the time by saying, oh, well, we need to fund some other departments and whatever. But it was very much, to me, a political message that you need to act right or we'll cut you again. And so I felt like, there needs to be some protection either in our Independent Press Act or preferably in the Constitution, but the Independent Press Act is what we operate under, that says you cannot cut our budget, or if you do, there has to be some sort of a threshold that you have to meet in order to do it. Like there has to be a supermajority of the council or something like that to prevent that from happening in the future. And
that happens with college papers. One of the adopted basic established rules is, under the First Amendment, is that the university or through the Student Government Association may not cut funding because of the content. They have to come up. And when it happens, and there have been cases then about it, you're trying to force the university or the SGA to explain why economically you had to cut it. And it's surprising that a lot of the SGA people aren't smart enough to come up with a budget reason. They'll just say, I can't stand what they say, which helps a lot when you're in court. So the idea, though, is, yeah, you've got to have some mechanism that says you can't cut us just because you don't like that we're printing that you're doing something wrong. I'm sure this isn't, yeah. So establishing that tenured executive was one of the points you'd want in your Constitution or the statute. I assume that's what your role is, right, Brian? You're the tenured chief executive?
Yeah, my job is a part of our Independent Press Act, and it states that I cannot be terminated without cause. And so my job is protected because they have to have a cause to terminate me, and also the editorial board is the only body that can take that action. The chief can't just walk into my office and say, "You're fired, get out." And I think that is something that's very important to have in legislation, because we all know that there are definitely executives out in Indian country that will do that. They'll walk in and say, "Get out. I just got elected. I have a mandate. Get out." And so I think having protection under the law, it can't stop them from doing it, but at least if you have a tribal court, you can take it to court and fight to get your job back.
So what would cause be? What does it define? What without cause, what's cause then?
I'm not sure. It's not defined in the Independent Press Act, but I think it may be defined in other parts of our governing structure. But it's something like stealing.
That's right. I was about to say it's probably something you committing an illegal act.
Yeah. Yeah, it's something pretty, doing something really bad, embezzling or something like that.
Same for I assume it's then if you're patterned the same way.
Yeah, and we still have to follow our nation's HR policies. We still fall under that. It's a very tricky dance we do on on what rules apply to you and what rules don't apply to you. You can't have it both ways. We hear a lot of that. You can't have it both ways, but so far we've been having it both ways. But it's well, our tribal court upheld our Independent Free Press Act. Our former chief, he was withholding information from us because, along with the Independent Press Act, you have to have an Open Records Act. You
Right.
have to have Open Meetings Acts. You have to have SHIELD laws. You have to have all of these other accompanying laws that go with that so you can do your jobs. And he was withholding contracts from us. So we sued him in our tribal court. Our tribal court upheld it. So there is, it is very essential for your nation to have a tribal court with good judges. But anyway.
An independent court. An
independent court.
Checks and balances that we talk
Right.
about in branches of government.
Yes.
One of the things when I read this, prescribed journalistic ethics, acceptable level of professional experience. Okay, that I could see as, a job description, but it's the ethics. So what do we end up, I teach media ethics. There's SPJ, there's radio, what used to be radio, television, now digital news. I mean, how do you figure that out? Which ethics code do you go by?
Well, we, in our law, we put that you have to follow the Society of Professional Journalists and Native American Journalists Association ethics laws. So that's where our, if we go outside of that, then they might have cause to complain about us or, for us to be reprimanded in some way by our board. But they can't come in and do that.
Because one of the problems with those codes is, especially on the journalism side, they have conflicts within the codes. Report the truth and minimize harm. And so we try teaching our ethics classes is how you go about making that decision so you can justify, because the decision's not going to, particularly the more gray the area, right, the less that's going to make everybody happy no matter which way you go. So it's a matter of being able to justify that decision and how you come up with it. So have you had to do that, Brian, where you've had to justify decision under the ethics code?
Not yet. Most of the time, I mean, honestly, almost all the time, when people question my editorial decisions, it's through the lens of politics. Who does it benefit? Is it benefiting this person? Is it benefiting that person? Is it hurting this person? Is it hurting that person? It's very, very rare that anyone will actually look at the SPJ Code of Ethics and say, well, you reported this, and I think it violates this provision of your ethical code. I actually would be happy if somebody cared enough to look at it that way, and that would be a conversation that I would be happy to have with someone, because I think that we hold to our code of ethics very closely. But most of, like I said, most of the complaints that we get are almost all more political in nature.
Which, A, shows you the power of the press, or at least, and by the way, it works with every other government, the perceived power of the press. You know, we worry about what the reporters, the news media, television, radio are saying about us because some portion, and it's typically the politically active portion of our population, is actually paying attention to what the media says. Has NAJA considered creating its own code of ethics?
We do have a code of
Okay.
ethics. We do have a code of ethics, and we have not been called to question yet, but if we did, we would totally go through that process and convene for that.
Kevin, anything to add? I've never known you this quiet. So declaring it an open forum, this is the issue that comes back we talked about earlier, and saying an open forum means, when we're dealing with the media, is that the government cannot control it. So you hire an editor, student editor, in my examples, to run it. The government doesn't control what goes in, much like your independent editorial board was not controlling the actual content of the newspaper, just the policies and how it runs. So public forum then means you, as a reporter, the editor, actually the editor controls everything, you know, you're free to say what you want as long as you bear the consequences, of course, for libel, invasion of privacy, those kinds of things. This says further a compelling interest. Basically, prior restraint not allowed unless there's a compelling government interest. Either yourselves or do you know of other examples where you've had prior restraint of tribal newspapers? Someone's walked in and said you may not do that.
I haven't had any examples of that. Not since I've been the editor. Of course, I became the editor about 6 years after we passed the Independent Press Act, so it had already had time to kind of set in.
Yeah.
So there hasn't been any prior restraint since I've been the editor.
Oh, that only happened to me before we got our Independent Press Act. The chief said that your job can easily be contracted out. So you can't write this, you can't write that. And when I first started, they wanted to proof every page and read everything. And the chief's column had to be on the front page with his picture and his message. And I had to put in every column from the interested Congress members that we have. They had to have their say too. And that was all unedited. And so that happened in the beginning, but once we got our free press, that all stopped.
That's called public relations newsletter.
Right.
That's not an independent press. And by the way, that universities, if they could get away with it, the reason those cases exist because the president walked down and did the same thing.
And I hope everybody notices, so when being involved with the NAJA Legal Hotline, when we hear complaints about prior restraint, they're from tribes that don't have a Free Press Act. Their tribes have Free Press Acts. I hope that you all make that connection because I think that's the most pertinent point of today's forum.
Yeah, and the 11 essential elements here are to help you create protections for your, create an independent media and why that's important. So freedom of information. I could spend, and I won't, hours going through the mechanics of this for you all. But yeah, the right of the public to access information and know what its government's doing. The preambles to Oklahoma's Open Records and Open Meeting Acts spell out the spirit of the law, which is what courts look to when they are interpreting what the letter of the law is. And it says, the Open Records Act says, Oklahomans are entitled to know and be fully informed about what their government's doing. Open Meeting Act says this statute's to facilitate the public's right to know about and understand governmental problems and processes. So my recommendation is you build in a very strong spirit in your statute and explain when that official says no, you may not have this information, as I try to explain to my students and the public, is then they're taking away from you, they're stealing from you your right to know what your government's doing and therefore to be involved in your government. Our statutes go on to say it's so you can exercise your inherent political power. I strongly urge you to write that into your code, into your statute or your constitutional provision some way.
Yeah, I really think it can't be understated. You could have the greatest independent press act in the world, and if you don't have access to documents, you really don't have anything to report. And I think it's important for people to understand that many tribal governments don't have Open Records Act, which means if you go to them and say, hey, I want the agenda for your meeting,
Right.
they can say, no, go away.
Well, they didn't even have to let you in the meeting, I'm assuming, right?
Yeah, they don't have to let you in the meeting. Or they can escort you from the meeting if they choose. And so this is, honestly, in many ways, it's almost a precursor to a good independent press act. Because if you don't have access to documents, it doesn't matter how much independence your tribal media has. If they can't access documents either, then it's going to be very, very difficult for them to do any level of meaningful reporting.
This is also a very taboo subject for a lot of tribes as well. It's not even thought of to approach the tribal council or their chief or governor or president or whatever they're called, because for so long it's been our tribal customs to really pay so much respect to our tribal leaders, and in a cultural and sometimes religious way. And that is what happened with our former chief, was that he was a religious and cultural leader. So to even think to say that he was acting in any kind of other way than something that was holy was totally taboo, and it turned the entire community against us, well, most of the community. But I'm curious, I know that most of the journalists in here don't work for tribal media, but how many of you read your newspapers by your tribal media? And how many of your newspapers have a free press? Does the Chickasaw Nation have a free press?
You don't look convinced of that.
And this lady right here, what tribe are you? Cherokee? Oh, well, that goes without saying, but.
Well, we know the problems you're having with your media then.
So.
Well, if you're interested in the mechanisms and advice on that, I help run the website and the blog for FOI Oklahoma. So if you look us up on the web, I have put up a lot of resources on open meeting and open records. We have videos up. I have primers up on the Open Meeting and Open Records Act, and I'm updating those now. We have material up there from our AG, so there are plenty of ways to go through the mechanism of it. That means like which records, what approach, what exemptions, how long of access, how long do you have? Give you an example. If you go ask for a record, how long do you have how long does the government have to give it to you? Y'all have that into your statute? Does it explain? I
Yeah.
can't remember. I know I've read yours.
Yeah, for us it's 20 days.
For us, it's 10 days.
Now, we don't have a set time limit in under the Oklahoma Open Records Act, and I'm glad, because I also know people in states where they have 20 days and 10 days, and when a government official doesn't want to hand it to you, they'll wait 20 days or 10 days or 30 days. Texas has a system where the government official can wait so long, I think it's 30 days, and then if they're going to deny, they have to go to the AG's office and get an opinion on whether they can. And there are some repeat offenders on that, to the point where the AG then has to talk to them and say, you're clearly trying to avoid by delaying, and access delayed is access denied. Ours says, the Oklahoma Open Records Act says, prompt and reasonable access, which the AG defined as only the time to locate and compile the record. Some states have 24 hours. So there's a give and a take, there's a pro and con to the different approaches to this. So when I say mechanisms, how it actually operates, but one approach or one overall philosophy is that there must be a presumption of openness. I think Pennsylvania was the last state to have a presumption of closed. And what that means, presumption of openness means that, particularly with records, that every record that government creates is presumed to be open unless a legislative act exempts it. So the burden is not on the person who's requesting the record to prove they have a right of access. The burden falls on the government official who's denying access to be able to show that an exemption applies. And I've got way more stories than I'm ever going to tell here of attorneys for local and state government who make up exemptions or say an exemption applies and it doesn't. So the next step is you've got to look up the exemption and make sure it applies. But I don't have to know all the exemptions right off the bat. And I tell people when they call me and say, well, do I have a right? I was like, go ask and let's see what they tell you. And if they tell you no, let me know and I'll help you figure it out. How is your press law written? Is it a presumption of openness?
Yeah, I think there is a declaration in there that records are open unless expressly exempted. And then we have a section of the law that says, okay, these are the things that are exempted. And it's fairly detailed, actually. It goes into, personnel records and some criminal records and things like that. So I think the presumption of openness is there.
Ours is the same. Everything's presumed open unless specified by law. And everything that's specified by law has something to do with our gaming revenue or something like that.
So when you have to appeal, it's through your tribal court. You don't have an independent agency to go to first, do you?
No, we would first appeal through our tribal court, and we have a Supreme Court as well as the Cherokee Nation.
We go through the Attorney General first. The Attorney General is supposed to be an independent arbiter of this information. One of the issues that we're actually having right now is there is an inherent conflict because the Attorney General is appointed by the chief. And so he has an interest in being reappointed by the chief. And so in order for us to contest a response to a records request, for example, we have to go to our attorney essentially is the Attorney General. Well, the Attorney General is also the attorney for the chief. And so there is an inherent conflict there, and I'm not sure how we're going to get that resolved other than to actually change the Independent Press Act and have the Press Act state explicitly the Cherokee Phoenix must have its own legal representation. Because right now we don't have access to the courts because our only access is through the Attorney General. Well, guess what? The Attorney General is not going to sue the chief because he didn't give us records. So,
and ours does not state, the Attorney General is not our attorney because we hired an outside attorney to come represent us because actually there's nothing in law that states that, but we had an Attorney General that had a very high ethics level, and he recused himself because he said there was a conflict because he was appointed by the chief. So we really got lucky there because that if we had had somebody that was too worried about their job, then we wouldn't have won.
Well, that's one of the flaws with Oklahoma's statute is there's no one to go to who's independent. You can't even go to the AG in our case. A member of the public cannot go to the AG and say the city of Stillwater or Oklahoma City or Tulsa is not giving me a record. Will you please rule on this? You have to go get somebody, a legislator to get you an opinion, and that takes a long time. Courts take even longer, and they're more expensive. So a number of states, hell, Mississippi has one, and we're behind Mississippi. That's never good. I'm from Louisiana. I can make fun of Mississippi. So another LSU graduate to my left. So Mississippi has an independent commission you can go to anyone and say they're not giving me a record. I believe I'm entitled to it, or they violated the Open Meeting Act, and that independent commission has the authority to then order the record released or declare whatever they did in the illegal meeting invalid. So I urge you to do what our legislature has not been willing to do, which is have an independent agency to go to, and saves you time and money. And of course, independent is the key there. So SHIELD Acts. Oklahoma's got a state SHIELD law, journalistic privilege. The idea that reporters need to have sources they can keep confidential. I know it sounds backward, but in order to have a free flow of information about the government to the public, you've got to be able to tell people, yes, I'm going to protect who you are, your identity, because if it's known, you're going to get fired at the very least. Your life will be made a living hell by the people you've just, explain what they're doing wrong. You've deep-throated for us, as you were saying earlier. You've been a source for us. So there has to be some protection then for those sources. My question, though, too, was how much does that go to citizen journalists? I was recently subpoenaed over the summer, as Kevin knows, writing for the FOI Oklahoma blog. And we hired an attorney who explained to the person in the civil suit that what I knew had nothing to do with them and they could get it from a public official. I wasn't going to turn my notes over. So when I see just journalists, our statute is written so broadly, the Oklahoma statute is written so broadly, it would have covered me. In some states, they're written so they cover college students and even high school students, and some they're very narrow and they only cover the media and even through circulation numbers and such. How are yours set up?
We have a Whistleblower Act, and that protects our community members and even media. We don't have a SHIELD Act per se, but it is language of a SHIELD Act that was an amendment to our Free Press Act that protects our staff so they can't be fired while doing their jobs. And that is to be determined by our board, not by anyone that's trying to fire them. So, or even HR is to be determined by our board. So, but that Whistleblower Act does protect our community members and citizen journalists who want to post on Facebook what they've seen or tweet out something else. But
Our SHIELD Act is actually modeled after Oklahoma's, and it's pretty broad, and it protects not only tribal media but also other just any Cherokee journalist. And so if you're Cherokee and you're working for the Tulsa World and tribal court tries to drag you in to talk about what you know, they're also protected under our SHIELD Act. Our SHIELD Act is fairly new, and the reason that we enacted it was actually because after our last general election in 2011, the candidate for chief, who was the incumbent who lost, filed a lawsuit, and he subpoenaed me and members of my staff because he felt like we had knowledge of some of the shenanigans that may have happened during the election, and he was going to bring us in there and have us testify as to what we knew. And so I said, no, we can't do that. And so we kind of ushered the SHIELD Act through to at least protect us and keep us from being dragged into a lawsuit that had to do with politics.
Kevin? I would point out, by the way, when I say, just to make clear, these SHIELD laws and journalistic privilege are not absolute, by the way. I mean, but what they set up is a balancing test for a court to go through and set a very high hurdle for the government to get over in order to get to your notes, get to your information that you haven't published. So it's not absolute, but it's something that's necessary. Otherwise, you're getting dragged into court all the time for any reason. And for a very low bar, then you're going to be turning over sources all the time.
And it's a deterrent.
Yeah, the deterrent to them doing that. All right, so we already talked about the funding. Anything else y'all wanted to bring up about the funding?
well, you will be challenged. It's just going to happen. I mean, as we all know, the advertising is going down a lot, and even at your mainstream papers, I'm sure that you know, the many layoffs that's happened in the past 5 years. So with us, our tribal government kind of looks at that and wants to keep us in tune with what's going on in the outside community. So they don't want to give us $1 million. They want us to be operating on a function that the outside community is also functioning on. And our funding has been cut in the past, and we've made do. And then the next year we'll make a justification for it to go up. But there was one time where they wanted to cut the funding entirely to the paper, and if it wasn't for our readers, you know, it would have been political suicide if they would have totally voted that through. But it was suggested, and I think they were feeling the waters to see if they could get away with that. And our community came to our defense, and they wanted a free press. So if you have loyal readers, a lot can be attained, and your funding can put a little bit of political pressure on them if your readers come to your defense.
And comes back to providing a service, valuable service. In a governmental system, our need to know what our government's doing, and that's the media that tells us that. So it pays off sometimes when someone's trying to cut your funding and your readers realize that you provide that valuable service. I like I say that sarcastically, the idea that we're going to cripple you as much as the local media is crippled by the budget. We don't want you to be better. We could fund you and you could be top salaries and have a hell of a newspaper, but we don't want that to happen. Okay.
It's clipping our wings.
Yeah.
And that's when they cut our budget, that's what they were trying to do, was clip our wings.
Now, branding was something, I don't know, Brian, if you were responsible for this one or not, but I was surprised by this. But the idea that you create yourself different logo, different brand, that you are not government. It's important for newspapers. You want to speak to that some more about why that's necessary?
Yeah, I think, well, I mean, just using the Cherokee Phoenix as an example, because we do have a distinct logo and a distinct style, and we're not the Cherokee Nation Cherokee Phoenix. We are just the Cherokee Phoenix. I think that it's really symbolic, I think, in our readers' minds that we are separate from the government. There's another item in the list that has to do with location. I think it's also it's very similar. If your physical operation is somewhere that is separate from where the government is operating, it's very symbolic in the minds of your readers that you are set apart, you are independent, and I think these are very real things that help to establish your reputation and your credibility as an independent news organization. And so I think it's important, and I've talked to several journalists who work for other tribal media, and I've told them, try to, even if you don't have an Independent Press Act, and even if you're not able to attain some of these kind of big ticket items, just brand yourself differently. Do some little things that kind of slowly start to put a little wedge between you and the tribal government. And sometimes it's just coming up with a unique name and logo, but I think if you can slowly start to drive that wedge, then maybe you can get to bigger and bigger things down the road.
That was the first thing we did when our Independent Press Act passed in 2008. We moved because we were right next door to our chief, and we completely relocated out away from our capital, away from all of that. So, and we also took out the nation. It was Osage Nation News, and now it's just Osage News. So we did that, and it was a very good change for us, and it is all symbolic, but it really does mean a lot to our readers.
Yeah, I went ahead and put number 10 up, which is location. And I can tell you, my first teaching job was at a small school in North Carolina. It was a private school, which means it wasn't affected by the First Amendment. And why they hired me, I had no idea. But, this was immediate bad relationship. I thought it was an independent press, and they didn't. And one of the things they wanted to do was then move the student newspaper into the student affairs office. So if you've got the students working right there with the people who run the public relations side of the university, they can keep an eye on them, and it's that mentality of this is what we really expect of you. So keeping the newspaper in a separate location, the same thing still goes on at public university campuses. Student newspapers like to have themselves, sometimes not even in the journalism school. We've had that discussion at OSU, someplace even off campus perhaps, or right next to campus, but definitely a location that's separate from the government. And I can certainly understand why for a tribal newspaper that would certainly be important. Might be one thing to have a satellite office down at, quote, City Hall, so to speak, where a reporter can work out of, but having your entire office there is not the best idea. Do you see a lot of that, Kevin, when you've talked with people at different newspapers? Do they tend to be right there where their whole office and operations right there, or do they manage to have a different location?
I think there's an issue when you have different scales of economy, because I know that the Cherokee Nations and Osage Nations are larger, and with some tribes, when you only have a small tribal complex, government complex, or it's just one building, I think that would be more difficult for them to do.
Because now you're talking, well, same thing for the students, but now you're talking rent, you're talking utilities, some other costs that come with it.
Yeah, but then I think too that the whole point of this is that do what you can to be separate, and there are different ways to communicate that, whether you're in the same building or not. But I think their point's well taken that if it's possible for you to be separate, even I've known, I don't know, this is just an idea off the top of my head, but I've known when some school newspapers have been pressured, local mainstream papers have hosted them.
Yeah.
And so who knows, maybe a tribal newspaper could be hosted by another local paper. Anything that you can do to establish this separation, I think would be a good thing. But then it just depends on, I think, size and scale and practicalities. But this is an excellent point they make.
Going back to the branding part, I think you talked about language and logos that symbolize it being different, and both talked about the name of the newspaper, taking nation out, not having it in yours. What kind of symbols or logos, what do you think would be, anything off the top of your head, or what you've used that sort of symbolize that you're not government, you're independent, and you're a watchdog, so to speak?
Well, I could talk a lot about the symbology behind the Cherokee Phoenix and the origin of the Cherokee Phoenix, but I think that it has to be culturally oriented. I think that any tribal media has to be sensitive to their culture, and they have to me, it's important to bring cultural symbology into the tribal media, because tribal media should be an embodiment of the people, not the government. And they should be performing a service for their people, not for the government. And so I think bringing cultural symbology into any kind of branding that they do, to me, is very important, because it's letting the people know we are of the people. We are here for the people. We are not here as just a mouthpiece of the government. And so, to me, any kind of branding that's done has to bring cultural elements into it.
I agree.
Well, that brings up the last one here, number 11. Kevin, do you want to talk to this? I know cultural match, you've discussed it quite a bit.
Yeah, when I served as a Udall Fellow at the University of Arizona one year, I was connected with research by people like the Native Nations Institute and others who have looked at issues about why certain laws don't work in Indian country. And we know, for instance, that some tribal constitutions are the product of the Indian Reorganization Act era. And so tribes were forced to accept certain language. And just to make a general statement, the research shows that the more a tribe creates its own language that reflects its own culture, the more successful those laws are. And so I'm just a big believer in that now. And, I'd also say, I know for myself, Shatasia Hoke, Micha Shilaki, Micha Nahola. I'm Choctaw and Cherokee and White. So Brian talks, I identify, I know more of the Choctaw culture from my heritage. I have a friend who's from the Salish and Kootenai tribes, who's an academic, and I remember him talking about certain customs they have and saying, dude, that would not work in Choctaw Nation, would not go over. But the principles would have been the same, but it would have looked different. And so we don't want, I personally, speaking for myself, I always told my students when I taught media law, if you show up wearing your First Amendment underwear and, try and, if it sounds like that you're trying to push the colonial mindset
Right,
down the
impose
throat of the
somebody- right.
tribes, then you're going to get rebuffed, and that sets back the process of free press. But I think that if you're involved with a tribe, you know something of the culture, you have friends in the tribe. Like I know I have dear friends who are Osage. It's different. It's a different culture, but we share a lot of the same values. And so it's just the recognition on the behalf of those of us who put this together as a Free Press Committee. You know, there are 567 federally recognized tribes. There are many other state recognized tribes. We recognize that there are many cultures within those tribes. And so just do it in a way that works for your people, that serves the people. And if you're part of that tribe, you know what it is. And then I will say, somebody at the NAJA convention pointed out to me one time this thing about there's the written law and there's the traditional ways, the traditional law, and how we resolve things. And so if the Constitution and the statutes and the code can match the traditional law, then it works better for the people. It fits their mindset. It fits their rhythm. But if it totally jars everything, then you're going to have a lot of conflict, and you're going to find people are less willing to do it. And I guess maybe because I'm older, I have grandchildren now, but I'm starting to get to where I would rather see situations where journalists and leaders, members of the community, really can talk and work these things out and figure out what works best for the tribe, instead of creating these false dichotomies like it's journalist against everybody. No, I think in Indian country, we really model that the press is there for the people. Mm-hmm. And we're there for the betterment of the tribe. We're there for the betterment of the people. And so I just know from the training I got and getting exposed to that research, you know, find that cultural match, find words that express, and maybe even in your own language, there are words that express these concepts better than freedom of the press.
Well, due to sunshine, you've explained to me how sunshine is a cultural, meaning sunshine laws.
Oh, yeah.
information.
So there are some people with the leaders of Choctaw Nation have been considering some transparency laws, and a point that I made and that I'll make publicly is that, you know, the Choctaw word, the original word for God, the Great Spirit, was Hashtali, which means the one who controls the sun. And the cultural teaching is that when the sun comes up in the morning, the sunshine guides us as we make decisions, and then when it sets in the day, then we can know that we were led right. And I pointed out it's a pretty strong metaphor. It's more than a metaphor to think that it's culturally consistent for Choctaws, for instance, to practice sunshine and transparency, because that's the essence of our culture. And you know, whether other Choctaws agree with that or not, you know, that's fine.
It's a strong argument, though.
But I think it's a strong argument, because I will also say I get irritated in the work that I do when I hear people say, well, you know, free press is just a white man's idea. And, well, no, it's not, because Native peoples practiced freedoms before white people showed up. And there's scholarship that shows that even the U.S. Constitution borrowed ideas from Native peoples. And we also know that the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, which was fully incorporated by the United Nations Declarations of Rights of Indigenous Peoples, guarantee these freedoms for all people. And so these are universal ideas we're talking about. So I don't mind admitting I like to decolonize things. I like to get it to where it's Native people getting back in touch with these traditional ideas, and then how do we articulate it in the 21st century in a way that works for transparency, for democratic governance, and so that our people grow and thrive and prosper. So, you know, if you're out there listening and you're going to come at me with the, you know, free press is just a white man's idea, you better be ready, because I'll argue with that. You know, because sometimes, I won't say every time, but sometimes I know that the people who are telling me that because really what they're trying to do is to hide their own corruption. And corruption is not a native value, period. At least those are my humble thoughts.
What do you think out there about the cultures of your tribes and the idea of having independent press, freedom of information, cultures acceptable in your cultures? Not everybody, it's like talking to my students. Not everybody at once, please. Wasn't a rhetorical question, but you don't have to participate.
I think most of my tribe is out of state. They, I don't know if you know much about the Osage's history, but we were once, some of the richest people in the world. So once that money came in, they all kind of said, forget Oklahoma, we're moving to California. So there's a core group of us left. There's around 2,000 to 3,000 that are, and maybe 6,000 that are left in Oklahoma, and about 2,000 to 3,000 that are around our cultural base. So our tribe, it was really easy to usher in the free speech and everything because most of our tribe has not lived culturally for a very long time. So we're trying to get back to that now. Whereas a lot of Oklahoma tribes still have a good, strong base of their culture, ours is kind of fleeting away, and we're trying to hold on to that. So being cultural is so important for our newspaper because a lot of our tribal members that have moved away really miss seeing a lot of the things that they did as children or hearing from their grandparents or whatever. And they really thank us for putting in stuff with the Osage language or old photos of our tribal members or just, they still, a lot of them have never even been to Oklahoma. So they really yearn for that explanation of what does this mean? What does that mean? I want to be Osage, and that's something that we have to have. So in my mind, when I think of a good balanced newspaper that's going out, we have to have that cultural component that local media cannot provide.
Yeah, and that's the media providing a narrative for a people. And you're better able to do that than other news, Tulsa World and the Oklahoman. And that's what a public wants. It wants to know more about its history and who it is. Newspapers do that all the time in different ways. And the Phoenix has got, right? Cherokee language is built in. I mean, I go to your website once in a while. I see the stories. And that's a purposeful.
Yeah, that's something that was a part of the original Cherokee Phoenix when it was published in 1828, English and Cherokee, and something that we continue to do today because we understand that without our culture, we are truly lost as a people, and so that has to be a part of what we do at the Cherokee Phoenix.
I do have one thing.
Yeah.
I was raised to not talk about it. I was raised that way, that we were not supposed to take photos, and we still don't take photos of our ceremonies out of respect for that, because what I was taught growing up was we do not share what all of this means, because outside will pick it up and try and mimic what we're doing and take away from our culture and distort it, is how I was raised. So there's a balance in what we do share. There's a lot more I could explain in the newspaper, but I don't, because in my editorial opinion, those people, if they want to learn, they need to come back and learn and participate. But we do give out stuff that, is commonly known, but anything else that's deeply religious or anything that's very valuable to the tribe, we do not put in there.
Well, and I've also published some research about how different tribes have different laws setting these kinds of boundaries for what you photograph and what you don't. And that's for those who are not native and who are really into independent journalism, it'll melt your brain, but you just need to trust us.
The culture, right?
And one of the things that I really want to challenge people to do is that, if you're doing journalism about the Osage people, you need to call people like Shannon. You need to ask them about, well, why am I getting feedback on that? Why am I getting resistance? Because there's just some things that it's just sacred knowledge. That's the reason why I like the ideas of elders and other cultural keepers to be involved in the conversation about creating these laws. Because, yeah, you don't want sacred knowledge revealed. I know, for instance, of a tribe. I don't like the following, but I understand why they do it. The tribal elders put sacred knowledge in their constitution. They wouldn't let a lawyer hired by that tribe read their entire constitution, which it's hard to imagine, but I understand the fact that if there's sacred knowledge, you want to protect it. So that's where organizations like NAJA, I think, have a great value, because people on the Free Press Committee, people who are members of NAJA, ought to be consulted, ought to be talked about. How do we report in Indian country? How do we do a better job of reporting in Indian country? And so I know that, I think I can speak for all of us, that we would love to get that kind of interaction with the mainstream media, so that, we do want to protect and promote culture.
It's just always important to be gracious. I mean, whenever you're dealing with any tribal leaders or anything, it's just number one, just be gracious before you come in with an iron fist. Yeah.
Questions from the audience? Comments? Shouting? There we go.
I'm just curious, if you ever do have situations where, somebody does take something and kind of exploit it, maybe know which way to steer, how do you go about that?
Well, it's very situational. Sometimes those things are protected under certain federal, state, or tribal laws, and so you can do that. One of the problems is that Western law and its constructs doesn't really acknowledge the unique significance of sacred knowledge. And so it's really difficult once it gets out to get it back. That's like the Hopi people had a really, when they were selling some artifacts in France, it was really difficult legally to deal with. I mean, it's extremely difficult. I would encourage people, attempt to deal with it legally. There are lawyers out there who I can connect you with who would be glad to help. I'm just not going to promise that the answers are easy, and the lawyers might say, "I'm sorry, but we really can't get that back." That's one of the reasons why the tribes have, a lot of tribes, especially in the West, tribes have really strict laws to protect things getting out. So what's still sacred and held close to the people, it's just really difficult to get at. And so it's easier to be preventative than it is to deal with it once it happens, if that makes sense.
And before you go the legal route, shaming does work. Our tribe has many forums for communication and talking about politics or talking about anything and everything, and they do. There was an incident a couple of months ago. A woman was posting some, I don't know where she found these articles, but there was some ancient Osage articles with some ancient symbols on there, and she was posting them on one of these forums, and she was putting down her interpretation of what she thought they meant. And there was a barrage of tribal members that was just like, "You don't know what you're talking about. You better take those down. That is disrespectful." I mean, they just went on and on and on, and she did. She took it down. So I mean, it's social media is a really good tool to come in and correct something if they're willing to listen.
Yeah, I was going to say that's the biggest thing, too. They have to be willing to listen.
They're willing to listen.
I really appreciate y'all talking about the different cultural aspects of how to approach tribes or tribal people on reservations, because it is you kind of have to kind of walk on eggshells, because if you're not on that tribe or not on that reservation, you don't really know their culture, and you should approach it as something it's their story, it's their intellectual property. have a subject I'm talking to or a person I'm talking to, and they're like, oh yeah, it's fine, something, film, but I always like to go through the tribal council to get the possible answers. So there's a lot of jump through hoops, and there's a lot of, a lot of times I want, once you come to the council meetings, they get to schedule around that. There's a lot of difficulty in that, but I'd rather approach it in the right way. Like I said, it's their stories, it's their land, it's just who they are that makes that kind of accumulation of, the culture. And, like for example, I just went to Red Lake Reservation. It's up in Minnesota. It's a closed reservation, so they don't, not many non-Indians live on the reservation, and there's a lot of restrictions for the non-Indians that live there. And we had went and talked to the tribal council and tried to do it the right way, and it's just, if more people would kind of approach, I guess, Indian subjects instead of, just already having a prefabricated idea that, I think that stories and the journalism that they get would reflect that a little bit more positively or strongly in their stories or however they're going to tell their stories.
How did she manage to film it? Did she have permission of the people that she was filming, or did she do it that they didn't know, or did they just not realize what she was? How did she deal with it?
Probably goes on the road and the person that was putting on the ceremony, if they give her permission, I mean, it should, a little bit of that should fall on them as well, but she's the one that's out there, she's the one that's, put herself in the middle of the story, the documentary story, made herself a part of the subject. So, but at the same time, it's kind of, the cultural person that gave them permission, and there's other documentaries that, like, I have a friend that was in primaries that, they were filming, but there was a certain limit that they would let them show. I mean, they would let them show outside the foot
Mhm.
some of the ceremonies, but, and then, the producer actually, didn't really feel comfortable with them actually filming some of the things we were filming, but, their medicine and their church leader at the time said it was okay to film this and this and this, but they ended up not going, they didn't do it so much, and this is pretty great. Yeah, a lot of times it goes over the spiritual leaders as well.
One of the things I love and appreciate about NAJA over the years is that there's been this effort to educate young journalists, because I would like to see more and more journalists from every tribe and culture, so that I wouldn't say they're the only ones to tell these stories, but I think they're the best to tell these stories, because they're going to understand. Like Shannon and I are sitting up here, you're talking about, like, I've participated in Sweat Lodge, and like, you don't talk about it. You don't talk about what happens in there, what's said. And so I don't know if she's participated, wouldn't even ask. But I'm just saying, it's like, no, you don't do that. But what also concerns me is that, having been involved in the past in journalism education, I don't think we do a good enough job educating young people who are in high school or college, when they do journalism about Native Americans, about why that's just a horrible idea. Because they think, oh, well, I got access, I have the right to be here. And no, you don't. So I just want to say how deeply appreciative I am of the organization like NAJA, who for years keeps working to educate people and have forum discussions like this. We need to get the word out how not cool what you described to me, and I think to a lot of other people, is.
Yes, ma'am.
This all seems like it's negotiated by people within the tribal language distribution. Does anyone make that kind of, is it obviously you want to talk about, but like, intertribal kind of ethics of what that tribe considers acceptable?
That would be up to the tribe to form. I mean, well, okay, for instance, I only know about what my tribe has done without going and researching everybody's tribe. But what my tribe has done is that we have an elders council, we have a cultural council, we have a historic preservation office, and we have like all these cultural departments that have all of that. If somebody calls the tribe, we'll probably call the chief's office, and they will get bounced to our cultural department. And then our cultural department will inform them what they can and can't do. And our cultural department has to be staffed by Osages. It's required. And we're not going to hire somebody that doesn't know anything about our culture to be in our cultural department. So whenever we get outside inquiries about this or that, or, we funnel them through to the appropriate agency within the tribe. But as far as a code of ethics on what is allowed to be done on our tribe, that really hasn't been brought up, other than we do have a freedom of press, and it does include outside journalists, like local media. So if local media wanted to come in and open records request things, they are allowed to. That's how our Independent Press Act works. Doesn't mean they'll always get it, but they are allowed.
I think that within at the Cherokee Phoenix, the way that we handle it is very different. We see culture as being separate from government in some ways. In other words, if we wanted to do a story about a stomp dance, we're not going to go to the chief and talk to him about that, because he's, not to mean it in a derogatory way, but he's a politician. And it's his job to run the government and to be the chief executive for the tribe and those kinds of things. If we wanted to do that, we'd go to the person running the stomp group. And he would be the spiritual leader of that stomp ground. And of course, he would say, no, you can't come. And we have made those inquiries in the past, and they've all been flatly refused, because there's a recognition that it's something that we don't share with the outside world. And we've always respected that. And so there's definitely a line at the Cherokee Phoenix between what is okay for us to report culturally and what is not okay. But if we feel like our reporting might be venturing into a more sacred cultural area, then we'll refer to those leaders for that kind of information about where that boundary is, as opposed to going to someone in the government.
Is that the same when somebody from an outside agency like the Tulsa World calls the tribe and wants to write something on a stomp dance? Like, what does the Cherokee Nation do? Do they have a code of ethics?
I don't think they have any specific guidance. I would say that for the most part, outside agencies will come and they'll interface with our communications department within the government. And it'll be up to communications to send them to the appropriate authority, but they won't send them to anyone outside of the government. They're going to send them to someone within our cultural department or within our education department who will answer those questions for them. But that's at the Cherokee Phoenix, because we have more cultural knowledge and are more in touch with the community. We understand that's not, they're not really truly the authority on those matters.
One problem I would like to point out, though, where sensitivity of these issues can go too far. I've been working on research and hopefully a book about the law and ethics of journalism in Indian country, and there are some tribes who have conflated regulations they have about access to information with how they regulate scholars doing human subjects research. And so in my book, writing about tribes attempting to censoring the press, tribes have attempted to censor me. And wanting, tribal, where I would have to submit my manuscript to a tribal government for them to approve it before it gets published. And so for me, even though I am sensitive to these cultural issues, it's like, no, not happening, forget about it. And so it means I've had to hold back some research because I refuse to participate in that form of prior restraint. So I just want to caution us to be certain that as we interact with certain offices, certain people about being sensitive about culture, the tribal government can't stop you saying what you want to say. But it's good to work out, I like the word negotiate that America used. It's good to negotiate these things, and I've had some conference papers talked about those issues, but when it all gets back to it, I think I can safely say those of us sitting up here, we're on the Free Press Committee because we believe in free press. We believe in the right for people to say what they believe and think and observe. We just know that free press is best protected if we do our best to be ethical, work with people, cooperate, But at the end of the day, it's all about, that's why, you know, as long as the basics of independent tribal media are protected and encouraged, because we believe in free press, and we're out and proud about that.
We're just about out of time. Anybody else with last question, comment?
I've been in front of council members that have to come on reservations before, and a lot of that, you know, I kind of upfront, you know, that they don't have editorial control, but I don't mind talking to, you know, having someone like a liaison that you can show, you know, and maybe get their feedback or comments. We use just wrong phrasing or pictures or whatnot, and then also Brian, for what Brian commented on, I think that's kind of situational as far as zoning, because, I mean, since you're kind of local, I mean, you might know the culture around, but when you're going outside your comfort zone and reservations that you're totally unfamiliar with, you know, then, I'll give you an example. I have a producer friend on Pine Ridge, and, he was telling me a story about, they had a show called Gangland, which is about
Yeah.
the United States. Well, this film crew, basically, without tribal permission, without anybody knowing, stuck on Pine Ridge, filmed these kids, they're hardcore gangsters, and then put it out there for, you know, commercially, and these kids got a lot of flack. I mean, but it was basically kind of there was an outrage that kind of went through the tribe. These kids got a lot of flack, you know, beat up and other things, but, you know, that's kind of an example of, you know, not doing it the right way, kind of being sneaky about what you're doing. And, you know, when, you know, if you're familiar with the culture of the stomp dance, you know, the people, yeah, maybe that would be okay, but, you know, when you're totally going to, you know, a foreign, you know, place, you know, a lot of times it's good to have that, you know, communication, at least with the communication departments of the tribe, you know. If they're fine with the communication's fine with it, then you have the stamp of approval. But I've been on, like, right now we're asking to go on the Southern Ute Reservation for this documentary on energy usage on tribal lands. So basically we're asking them, you know, where they're getting their money from, you know, through their use of coal and oil and natural resources. So to go on the reservation and film whatever story is kind of inappropriate without having the kind of stamp of approval.
Yeah.
So they kind of made us come to talk to the council and, you know, to tell us exactly, they wanted to meet us and find out who we are and find out a little bit more about the project. And then, you know, right now we're still kind of in limbo waiting on permission because we have elections in between. So,
Got to start all over again, right?
yeah, it'll start all over. So we'll have to meet them next year.
All right, well, join me thanking our panelists for sharing their time. I think the next session is at 11 in here, if I recall the agenda. So go out and stretch your legs, get something to eat or drink, and I'll see you back in here in a few minutes.